All right. We don't necessarily need his image, right? If he wants to. Sorry, Borit. I was saying that you don't necessarily need the image.
I can do it now without microphone. Actually, this is also not
Okay.
because we see all intestines
I think it's fine.
and primordiality of what is. So I have to go closer. Maybe the now translators they hear. You don't hear now? Okay,
Hello?
perfect.
Okay.
So that's nice. Hi, Karim. Yes.
Yes, of course.
Where should we sit while Kareem is speaking?
Oh, heck. Okay.
Where should we sit while Kareem is speaking?
Sorry?
Where should we sit while Kareem is speaking? We don't need to be on while he's speaking.
You need to be. You
We
don't
don't
need to
need
be.
to be on while
Okay.
speaking.
Fine, but it's fine, huh? That also Karim hears it. Huh? Okay. So let me introduce you, Alexandra Hidako, Joseph Jacona, and Karim Samuels, who is now in New York City. Is he?
Yes. Remotely.
They are part of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary collective, which is called Anon, and which I got to know online because of their manifesto, hashtag #AltVogue, which was published on February 2017.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And which got, I mean, my immediate attention and in terms of what we try to meditate around, economy of doom, and which is point of departure and not the target domain. I found really useful to invite them, and also honestly I have to say that as a members of future generations. So welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, Kareem, you can go. Oh, wait, 1 second. 1 second. I don't hear anything from him. Yeah? To my mouth? I don't hear anything from him, though. No.
Better?
Oh. No? Yeah?
Better?
Yeah, we hear you now. Yeah?
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Can you hear me? Yeah, right? Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Okay, I guess I'll start. I guess an introduction of the text that I'll be reading, and it's called an alternative geology of the world, world in the paradigmatic sense, as opposed to geophysical. So I guess I'll just jump into the text. I'll put this little canvas out there. All right. All right. So the prefix hyper implies something transcendental, going over, beyond to a virtual point, or a potentiality above three-dimensional space. Something a priori to experience. Its antonym hypo implies something imminent, below, under, or a posteriori to experience. The neologisms, hyperstition, and and I guess the term superstition literally means standing over, as in these myths or belief systems are built over the structures of society and are sometimes exaggerations or delusions. Hyperstition involves mimetic hyperbole, positive feedback loops that tend toward meltdown, A hypostition is its contrasting and eventual crystallization into an eternal essential truth accumulating under the surface. So like hypostitions are the ground zero of a social superstructure and are the fertilizer and for the cultivation and production. So if all that is solid melts in the air, then hypostition would mean then all that is air fossilizes. Culture is built on top of the myths of the past. Language, signs, and other cultural contagion are vectors for hegemonic world making and perpetuation. So art or media would diagnose this culture by imitation. When you apply an adequate amount of critical thinking, media is then becomes like a little social thermometer, and art reveals the conflict between disclosure and concealment, or like what Heidegger called the conflict of world and earth. So if a medium is a vector transmitting information from subject to subject, then media is the ecology of communicable strata. Like, media literally means medium in the aggregate. So the cultural organism germinates, spreads, and grows in magnitude as it infects subjects, communicating across like the language mesh. So, and you could interpret language as this lattice structure that connects subjects from space, superimposes intelligibility onto real and new things in of themselves, and like facilitates symbolic order in the flow of like semiotic exchange. Hypostition, it's like best expressed in Walter Benjamin's conception of time as the crystallization of phenomena congealing and appearing as a singularity. The change from like a hyperstition to a hypostition is achieved by this like monadic congealment, which Walker Storrs, who coined the term hypostition, calls cryochronology or frozen time. The monad is the event horizon of like this like spiral, actualization, like a sign of messianic cessation of happening, according to Judith Butler's reading. The messianic doesn't happen in time; it's the cessation of that happening, cooling. So, like historical materialism is like redefined by messianic time, and so hyperstition then is like a self-organizing phenomenon, the viral runway process of virtual organisms penetrating physical space. Its culture as like the interplay between the transcendental dimension of virtuality and like materialist immanence, the movement of actualization as an actual labor process. So bodies, minds, which are all coagulations or decelerations in the flows of like biomass, genes, means, and norms, according to Manuel Delanda. So, like if you imagine like a substrate, the substrate starts as like an atomized node or like a singular object or subject within like its own individual causal system. The node coexists, interacts, and moves with other nodes across the spatial site. This movement is what constitutes a flow. These flows eventually generate a syntax binding the substrates into an assemblage of cohesive rhythms. The flow is diagrammed and becomes geometric as these substrates increase in complexity and volume. Their movement across space intensifies and a spontaneous order emerges out of their formation. The flows take on a form at the macro scale as these nodes interact and coalesce into a structure at the micro scale. This process of singular nodes scaling towards virtual potentiality is the stochastic process that's like accelerating. And this process is crucial to things like cellular formation, crystal structures, geese migration, intelligence, etc. When this process is assigned to social relations, be it cultural, economic, or political, as a discipline, is when you're describing, what is an accelerationism, as opposed to the broader general term. As mentioned earlier, space and time are phenomenological objects. That is, they aren't like real in and of themselves. It's not useful to think of reality as a three-dimensional object evolving in linear succession, but a non-Euclidean field where space and time are concurrent geometric causal relations, or space-time. Think of three-dimensional space as a graph and numbers as coordinate points, or the total quantifiable sequences on the graph. Space can be reduced to the causal relationship of flows, objects, and events. the distance between coordinates on the graph, and the dimension of time can be reduced to the exponential expansion across the axis of the graph, tracing the locality of coordinate points into like observable forms or maps. Geometry, like its siblings, physics and chemistry, is a science of forms, their functions, scope, and configurations within space. It's a science of errata insofar that substances create shapes, patterns as they interact, and in order for these forms to exist, they have to be realizable at like some virtual level. Matter itself is just the end result of atomic substrates tethered by their covalent bonds into molecular compositions which make up the elements of the universe. And those substrates have their own substrates at the quantum level. This like phase space is the domain of a god, we would say. But what if you have to then ask yourself, like, what is a god? Are gods, fully autonomous bodies without organs, large scale protocols, indifferent and incomprehensible to the substrates that constitute its geometry? Or are they, spirits, disembodied intelligences that are within but beyond matter? Bodies without organs are like Boltzmann brains without bodies. So we could say that there's a conspiratorial aspect to this, and the conspiracy goes like this: that there are two dominant gods within the contemporary linguistic rational god and a substantial nature god. If you take me on some of the language from Genesis, in the beginning there was only primordial phase space, the void and entropy. There was no world, there was only the wilderness, pure substratum of being. If modern science is correct, then the Big Bang was the first hypostition, a cessation of physical boundaries to a singular event, the matrix of all virtual possibilities. The Gnostics believe that the intelligible universe of substance is the creation of a blind idiot god who imprisons intelligence to matter. You can imagine the Demiurge as like a diarchic protocol, a hypostatic union of two gods. The rational linguistic god, which was better understood as a diagrammatic causal system of functions, and the substantial nature god, which should be better understood as like a spatial material causal system of forms and their dynamic processes. You can imagine like the irrational linguistic god is like infinitesimally microscopic. At the same time, it's ever expanding, constantly shape shifting. It's enveloping space. It's something inherently colonial. It's like, colonizing the void with substances, imposing its regime of like imperceptible underlying order. It's the intelligence already embedded within forms, the blueprint for every body without organs, and it's the very first Boltzmann brain. It's transcendental parasitic line of code, mutating fractal intelligence, whose internal logic is as follows: the absorption of noumena and the creation of phenomena, the absorption of all things, the reconfiguration of entropy, and to signify and absorb signification. It condensed quantum waves into elementary particles, arranging them into molecular grids, which make up chemical compounds, the building blocks for simple and then eventually complex matter gestated organic matter, matter that can replicate its line of code at the genetic molecular level. Consciousness itself is, you can imagine, is a emergent property of chaotic fluctuations within substances, connective tissue mass and muscle fibers, skeletal architecture, microbiota cultures in the gut and on the skin, blood flow traffic, hormonal fluxes, responsive skin coat communicating sensory information through a circuitry of stimulated neurotransmitters. It's an active network of systems and subsystems working in tandem, scaling toward a holistic enclosure of being, or, again, a singularity as a cessation of corporal happening. There was a blueprint before, and before that there was a rough sketch of the structure. The potentiality of the object. Think of like all the necessary planning, mapping, and schematization that goes into infrastructure. Before the acquisition of raw material, the construction crew, the machinery, the tools, the management of the project, the blueprint is a priori thing. the machinery that it diagrams. Existence as an intelligent phenomena, the world is reducible to like algorithmic sequencing. Lines of code assembled into abstract geometries, mnemonic acceleration as a runaway process, breaking away from its microscopic, accelerating to forms of a higher order, continuing the process. So that system of processes, congealing into a mass, that would be, such would be like, that's the domain. We're calling this substantial nature God. Abstract concrete geometry. Blueprint becomes molecular alignment, becomes the brick and mortar for the pyramid. Sediments and rock formations and tectonic plates make up its base. Biomass exert their labor to construct it. Neurons created the brains, which brought the pyramid into being. Social formation, the bodies breathe its construction. Social subjects, their thoughts and actions around it. Creating myth, worship it. So immanence can modify and create virtuality of its own accord. The earth, it conditions thought. Like primordial God, with like information of nature as a concept, and what will itself, a self, a phenomenology, as not a subject in this environment. From this distinction, nature was not. The world encompasses the way humans conceptualize themselves, usually in a often privileged and framing on the filters that record and little presupposition take on the structure when communicating with subjects.
Hey,
The world is a paradigmatic system.
Kareem. One sec. Let me call you back.
Sure.
No, I'll keep making you bigger. I don't know if we have one. Do you have a headset?
Do I have a headset?
Yeah, do you have headphones with a microphone on them?
Sure. Give me 1 second.
Cool beans.
Apologies. Better?
Say something?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot better.
Yeah, can you go back like a sentence or two?
Sorry, what was that?
Can you go back a sentence or two?
Sure.
Yeah.
Wait, full screen it.
All right. So I guess we'll go back to the world encompasses the way humans conceptualize themselves in relation to nature, usually in a hierarchical way, often privileging an anthropocentric framing that other thinkers have put forth, and how their presuppositions take on a structure of their own when communicated with other social subjects. The world is a paradigmatic system, a set of propositions and axioms where living and non-living objects are arranged into stations. Hobbes, Locke, and other early thinkers start with man in nature in order to situate their frameworks. Both have these fixed and oppositional ideas of the natural world, with Hobbes proposing that nature is something which should be avoided, and Locke, who thought the state of nature preferable to absolute rule. If we made the argument that consciousness is an emergent property of matter, then culture is the emergent property of intelligent subjects communicating and moving across physical space. Language homogenizes social bodies into a cohesive formation. Societies we can interpret as broad neural networks of interconnected units distributed across physical space. And hegemony is the nucleus binding together culture through a shared frame of reference. And this cohesion is the force which organizes, the molecular intelligent subject into a molar virtual being. States are established by mapping terrestrial space, terraforming the earth into a sovereign territory. Body politic as body without organs. So empires, nations, states are immersive structural formations, virtual organisms facilitated by a synchronous network of hegemonic communication. The nation state is it's pure information. The end result of collective knowledge and social consensus. The transformation of social formations into political structures, it's an autonomous process. And the features of these structures are imagined. It's the hardware is the social bodies which constitute it, and the state takes on the psychological properties of its social constitution. And economics, being a dimension of exchange similar to communication. Language by extension, culture and social bodies are viral. They move from bodies to bodies. The sexual transmission of genes is the cultural transmission of memes, as the geographic transmission of bodies is to the internet's transmission of data, and the market's transmission of value and exchange. The corpus of law for pre-literate societies is the body, making it a literal corpus. The obligations and restrictions of social conduct in a community are inscribed through the body. This is a cultural conditioning, morality that is not orally transmitted but performed. Rituals are invisible social machines which regulate the body with serialized patterns, neurotic signification, stratifying subjects into assigned groups. Taboo, a line of demarcation indicating the boundary of the sacred and profane, or acceptable and unacceptable behavior. Hegemony is maintained by this algorithmic sequencing, which characterize the higher order consciousness of its conglomerated body. Imagine if capitalism isn't an alien invasion from the future, but a primordial stowaway, a parasitic overextension of nature into social relations. Capital is more than a set of class relations with a material basis. Capital is the material form of rationality. The attributes of value is the nexus point of transcendental virtuality and immanent corporeality. According to Deleuze and Guattari, capital becomes a very mystical being, since all of labor's social productive forces appear to be due to capital rather than labor. Working across the globe, it rearranges the environment by coordinating productive flows according to the computations of distributed ledger, which is exchange and its architecture, if we accept that markets are computers, appearing as if it's some transcendent mystical demon, whether it's parasitizing the situation of human subjectivity and form in communicative capitalism, or hyper-industrialization, catalyzing a metabolic rift across the earth, pushing the protocol of colonization and extraction beyond the cloud, beyond digital space into outer space. It's kind of crucial that we identify capitalism as an ecosystem. The process of production and labor and the economy of commodity exchange is an invocation ritual. Ritual being action or flow serialized into a prescribed order or syntax, and labor being the exertion of force. Labor also, it implies or it means the process of birth. Rituals fix social power and enact rules. And this is as true as it is in the most primitive cultures as it is in the most advanced. If the capitalist economy is a tissue mass, then like we're the cells. And the socioeconomic metabolism is this symbiotic relationship of material flows exchanged between people and their environment. Capitalism, however, is unstable, violent, and the mechanisms of its instrumental grammar tend toward heightening self-destructive contradiction and radical change. Historical development is a disintegrating process. If we imagine the metabolism of the planet, currently trapped in precariat and proletarian labor, is fighting an agentified, transpersonal, quasi-demonic force called value, which is a parasite within its flesh. Capitalism is the temporal spatial incarnation of the blind idiot god of substance nature and the parasitic rational linguist god. It's the totality of humanity's collective activity and labor as a geophysical force, invoking abstraction into being on the immanent plane. Value, like commodities, don't just come out of thin air. Gods require blood sacrifice to be immanentized. It subsumes all the Earth's resources, commodifying, virtualizing life itself until its host can no longer sustain the dynamic. Its invocation is a violent metabolic rift, Heideggerian alchemy, transmuting the immanent excremental material earth into a transcendental sublime aesthetic, the world. Life is traded in exchange for value and mediated by death. The biosphere is transmuted into pure profit, sustenance for the growing economy as it gestates throughout time and across space. Nature is inherently conservative and definitely not perfect. The natural beauty of the planet Earth is no less deceiving than that of luxury advertisements in glossy magazines. Our entire natural history is a dump yard of obsolete technologies, which in most cases, unfortunately, have been able to survive thanks to procreation. Civil society and the state were supposed to lead us out of the nasty, brutish state of nature. However, it was just a socialized version of nature. The neoliberal cybernetic human farm is just one of many transitory stages toward the pure slaughterhouse of hypercapitalism. Capitalism, depends on social subjectivity to function. Spectacle creates and reorients transcendental knowledge, itself an emergent property of the ritualistic nature of production and consumption. This parasite is contagious, readjusting its protocol, accommodating the desire, and assimilating the affects of its host into its operating system. Infected subjects are possessed, and social relations follow the axiom of artificial scarcity. Eat or be eaten. Society becomes a competitive food chain as a result. Its tendency toward unlimited growth and consumption is a result of its ability to absorb the transcendental categories that shape the reality of social life. In this exchange, we are given a false sense of individualism. When I work, I sell my labor power. I only think of my personal gains, just as the capitalist only thinks of his own when he buys your power. In this process, although my job is to produce commodity for others, I completely neglect this when performing my job. On a deeper level, although I perform a job for the community, I forget that the community exists. It's limitless and abstract, but totally not without form, or rather, the material constitution of its form is constantly readjusting. Once one makes $5 of surplus, their competitor must make $6, and so on and so on. Note that we said must. In society, we have come to demonize the capitalists for their moral failings, whether greed, corruption, etc., which doesn't address the real problem at hand, which is that inequality is an inseparable built-in feature of capitalism. While you, as a worker, are at the disposal and whim of the capitalist is at the disposal and whim of capital. Sorry. That means once he achieves $5 of surplus, he must outdo himself and make 6 in order to flourish. To take this further, this means that no one group of people can be faulted for the flaws of capitalism necessarily. And these problems arise simply when everyone does as they should and plays their roles. Necropolitics refers to the political suspension of juridical order and the expression of the sovereign's power to render the subject bare life. Necroeconomics then would be the economic dimension of the suspension of judicial order and the injunction of the subject to become human capital, or the profitability of bare life. To put it more simply, the type of inequality developed nations experience and the type we make developing nations experience when we use their countries for raw goods while importing war and genocidal accumulation is a direct byproduct of the system of labor we have implemented, from incentivizing debt to exploitation and incarceration, from industrial pollution to the fungibility of the body beyond labor into commodified flesh. Examples like poaching, human trafficking, organ harvesting, factory farming, the leather industry, etc., and the subsumption of all organic matter into abstract digits of capital. Surplus value as an extinction event. We've engineered and continue to engineer a privatized, crisis-based political world system whose imperial protocols supported by multinational corporate financed military-industrial complex. Scaling the field of worry down a bit, capital represents to the human race and to the planet Earth a demon of comparable anxiety to Laplace's demon. Necropolitics and necroeconomics is the back-end dictum of transcendental parasitism. That is the axiom of capital, being related to the transcendental or transitioning to the transcendental. Or put it another way, as capital becomes virtual and global, extending across all territory and abolishing it, and all things and processes become fungible, then it creeps toward the realization of Laplace's demon. Capital's regime intensifies, and the human is pushed out of any meaningful engagement with the world. Gods also require mediums, prophets, or disciples to summon them into existence, so it has human co-conspirators. In the past, individuals would blame their illicit behavior on the devil for tempting them into sin. Regimes would justify their bloodshed as an act of God, and kings maintained the position that their nobility was a divine right ordained by God's mandate. Is there really a difference between a deity and a demon? And if there is, does it really matter all that much? Intangible abstractions have always been a convenient scapegoat for the ways in which the conditions of death are legislated by humans. The demiurge parasite is to blame, but let's also identify the guilty human parties involved. And this is our question. Can intelligent life free itself from the chains of capital, usurp the necropolitical world order? To do so would require not a revolt against capital in the form of primitivism, protectionism, nationalism, or other anti-historical reactions that would control or levy capital flows, but a revolt against our own human masters who purport to be in control of a thing which is ostensibly uncontrollable, automatic, and autonomous.
Thanks, Kareem. So Alexandra is going to present next. This one is going to be a bit shorter. And then I'm going to present, and then Diane will present. Is that true?
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
All right.
Is Kareem going to stay with us?
Oh, I guess. Are you
I'm
gonna
still
stay?
here.
Okay, if you want to turn your sound off, you could stay if you want. Okay. The modern liberal subject is one that may be atomized beyond repair. From its moment of conception, the idea of liberty served as one that made a necessary break between the people and the absolute power of the sovereign. But this idea of commonly shared freedom begot unforeseen consequences. John Locke's conception of liberty is explicitly linked to that of property, one of the fundamental natural rights that precedes societal life, and he posits that since man in nature is perfectly free and owns himself and his labor, then anything that he uses for or mixes with his own labor is then his own property. In order to usurp the idea of monarchs ruling through divine right, Locke moves power to the category of natural rights, which are inalienable, and are that which a sovereign cannot violate, or else it should be overthrown. Around this time, theorists like Robert Filmer argued that at the moment of Adam's creation, he was deemed monarch of the world. Because Adam's fatherhood extended over his children, Filmer argued, this right to rulership was passed down hereditably as the king does to his children, and this ensured that divine rights of the sovereign and his kin. Locke breaks this monarch god and writes, God, who hath given the world to men in common, hath also given them reason to make use of it, to make to the best advantage of life and convenience. The earth and all that is therein is given to men for the support and comfort of their being. Though he directly challenged the prevailing idea of divine right, he then proceeded to link God's power to nature and us who have a direct relationship to God via nature as a proxy. Civil society is created to protect one's property, and to Locke, property flows from that which is their own, and thus one's life and liberty, and estate, private property, is bound up with what is considered property. This, he theorizes, is the natural law that guides us. Locke's empiricism carried on ostensibly to those who, inspired by his thought, wished to enshrine parts of it in a form of government. Though a subject of debate, some believe the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that all men are guaranteed under government in America's Declaration of Independence, borrows from the Lockean idea, though a few founding fathers tried to downplay the idea of estates as an inherent right. Nevertheless, many of Locke's ideas were preserved. Given that narratives around the state of nature had a certain lore at the time, we must examine how, in the realm of political philosophy, what presents itself during the Enlightenment era as a seemingly varied and colorful debate actually ends up at the same destination. From Hobbes and his strong sovereign who must reign because of the brutish state of man in nature, to Montesquieu's account of fearful humans led to society by timidity, to Rousseau's peaceful, happy individual whose life is ruined by the introduction of property, all rationalization for proposed modes of governance took root in the conception of nature before it bloomed outwards. These narratives about the natural world and this form of logic, which puts humans at the center, binds those who are or have at one point been subjects of the Western world and those who, though spared from direct influence by these tales, have had to contend with them. While liberalism promoted the idea of liberty for humanity, it did so by way of propping up what Sylvia Wynter referred to as naturalized modes or genres of humanness. I'm arguing that transcending these narratives may extend well beyond phenotypic categories. Though doing so may signal the end of the world, it is imperative that we do so, or else, given where we are in relation to crises such as the environment, we may find ourselves at the threshold of the apocalypse. Though the Western world has arguably removed God from politics, breaking him up into a collage of varying interpretations that are then filed under religious freedom, we still confront our secular traditions of market and state through a theological lens. Some proclaim that market forces, the totality of capitalism, are simply a natural process, the state of nature in the here and now. However, Marx notes, political economy starts with the fact of private property. It does not explain it to us. It expresses in general abstract formulas the material process through which private property actually passes, and these formulas it then takes for laws. It does not comprehend these laws, i.e., it does not demonstrate how they arise from the very nature of private property. Many atomized liberal subjects indoctrinated within the Western world internalize the laws of nature as capitalism to varying degrees. This notion, taken to its farthest form, claims that capitalism is competitive, that it exists in a historical progression of wars and conflict, and it is a system in which the victor is rewarded for his efforts. An extension of nature that acts as a sorting mechanism, the market moves people through space and time, but it moves us in ways that are guided by our abilities as rational actors. Taken to its extreme, this logic morphs into rigid social Darwinism. It is when one reaches this point ideologically that the logic of capitalism begins to form solid structures before its adherents, and the monolithic Christian deity is split into two gods, both of whom appear with clarity and intensity. Within the Old and New Testaments, there are tales of those who accept or deny the word of God only to be punished or rewarded accordingly. Simply because one does not accept the narrative presented does not mean that one can exit and escape to a world devoid of its logic. The life that a subject leads, even if it's one that is actively in opposition to these ideas, must still contend with them in some way in order to understand what it is they'd strive to overcome. We now find ourselves in a peculiar paradox in which our Earth has been deeply and possibly irreparably affected by the logic of a simulation that prides itself on its conceptual relationship to nature. The narrative tells us that if life is bestowed upon us by natural law, then government must be dedicated towards its protection. Yet some subjects, excluded in relish to a space that exists outside of human, have historically been selectively subjected to conditions and treatment that other humans have not. What we should examine then is the moment when life and death overlap. As Giorgio Agamben notes, the very nature in which liberal constitutions are set up allows for sovereigns to sometimes occupy the state of exception, a space in which aspects of the Constitution may be suspended, rejected, altered, after which the governing body or individual is given permission to function from a place that exists extrajudicially. When speaking of moments of bare life in the state of exception, he points to Guantanamo Bay as an example. He states, in the detainee at Guantanamo, bare life reaches its maximum indeterminacy. Similarly, the prisoners of Guantanamo are reduced to biological objects confronted by power that exists to be manipulated by it. They lived outside of the boundaries of the judicial order and could not seek legal counsel. They were sleep-deprived and their bodies were abused and humiliated. Yet when they chose to refuse food, they were force-fed. Thus, though prisoners of Guantanamo Bay had lost their access to the rights a state promises, they had lost all autonomy over their bodies as well. Reduced to a biopolitical apparatus and nothing else, they could neither kill or be killed. Bare life. But what about those who are still within the nation's borders but are conceptually kept outside of the walls of another, more prized concept, and thus live lives that are less than as a result? If we can accept the idea that what is intended to be a temporary suspension of law can become the rule of law, then how do we conceptualize those who are deemed ungovernable because of ideologies or unwritten ideas that make themselves known in law, either explicitly, implicitly, or some combination of both? The state of exception is placed on those individuals that are then kept outside of the bounds of the law. American democracy, and to varying degrees, other liberal forms of government from their outset started with a defined subject who was allowed to have rights, a rational being who was thought to have given up absolute freedom in exchange for protections, and the establishment of negative rights in the American sense, that which government will not under any circumstances encroach upon. However, the subject granted access to rights and thus a preserved life was so narrowly defined that, while the initial liberal subject and the apparatuses of the state both thought they were encapsulating life and vitality, it was simultaneously encrypting the idea that those individuals who fall outside of these conceptual bounds can be pushed and bent towards another logic entirely. For Frantz Fanon, as someone deeply beholden to the study of psychopathology, the structure of the state is synonymous with that of the family, and he notes in every case the analyst clings to the concept of the family as a psychic circumstance and object. Before Fanon, even though an entire discipline built off of Freud's ideas had existed for some time, no one had asked whose family is being conceptualized in psychotherapy and to what ends. He claims that in Europe, the family represents in effect a certain fashion in which the world presents itself to the child. There are close connections between the structure of the family and the structure of the nation. Militarization and the centralization of authority in a country automatically entail a resurgence of the authority of the father. In Europe, and in every country that is civilized or civilizing, the family is a miniature of the nation. He argues that the black subject, as a colonized subject who has been incorporated into the fabric of such a society, is confronted with a foreign image, an unknown archetype that is impressed upon him. Unlike the colonized subject, the family's rules for the colonizer are replicated at home, and as the child emerges from the shadow of his parents, he finds himself once more among the same laws, same principles, the same values. A boy who grows up with a normal family will be a normal man. Since this archetype is made to be synonymous with the ideal, the other subject can't help but try and recognize themselves within it and actualize it. However, after repeated exposures to the fact that they cannot be recognized this way, insanity can ensue. What I extract most from Fanon's analysis is the idea that the ways in which governance appears to us are shaped by complex narratives, of which each individual, group, and nation is enveloped by. Even those subjects who historically were not granted access to the category of human in its highest form are confronted by the narrative, the tale of the man who overcame his environment and could master everything his hands could touch. The other is encouraged by its surroundings to see itself in these structures of governance, family projected, and as a willing participant within the natural simulation that is the market. Take these seemingly disparate ideas and view them on a macro level, and you begin to see that the notions of state and commerce feed into each other for sustenance. In The Ends of Man, Derrida critiques Sartre as existentialism when he does, he aims directly for the conception of human reality itself. Thus, even if one does not wish to summarize Sartre's thought under the slogan, existentialism is a humanism, it must be recognized that the major concept, the theme of the last analysis, the irreducible horizon and origin, is what then called human reality. Philosophical inquiry is necessarily historical and situational. There is an uninterrupted metaphysical familiarity with that which so naturally links the we of the philosopher to we men, to the we in the horizon of humanity. The natural narrative that guides the market is aided by a conception of a biocentrically viewed world. We can see this reflected in the Nazi regime's obsession with the rigid examination and classification of bodies, and we can see it in the less often talked about eugenics that was readily accepted in the United States before and after World War II. We can see this in the 1950s when Puerto Rico became the testing site for the first birth control trials in the US. This edible panopticon, as Beatrice Preciado calls it, was originally tested on brown bodies before being given to white housewives. In describing this history, she states, "There is no universal human body, but a multiplicity of gendered, racialized, and sexualized living beings and organic tissues. Within modern capitalism, male and female hormones and organs don't have the same biopolitical value." What starts as a hormonal pill created out of a Western obsession with regulating the body becomes attached to the narrative of helping good, white, Christian families manage their procreation, which is then tested on Puerto Rican women, the idea being that if the uncivilized can use it, then it's good enough for the white housewife. Ultimately, it lands in the hands of this subject, and she comes to self-regulate herself and her biological mechanisms within the domestic realm. Liberalism, then, has been irreparably interlinked with the conception of exclusionary freedom. But there are also ways in which this political economic pairing affects us all, beyond particular and specific subjects. The working subject under capitalism both performs labor and specific tasks and is confronted with commodities that are marketed as being able to fulfill a particular need or perform a task devoid of the labor that has created it. Commodities contain within them the potentiation for desire fulfillment that then float around and confront us as if magic, specters without origin. In our current era, we find ourselves performing labor constantly, but because our physical bodies aren't involved and a power mechanism has not been designated that time explicitly for work, we cannot see it. In the era of Internet 2.0, has ushered in a heavy extraction from us in the form of data. The Frankfurt School's simultaneous critique of and addition to the Marxist idea of alienation is that labor is not only the site of our discontent, is not the only site of our discontent. What we consider free time or time off from work is also subsumed under capitalism, and it exists in relation to our working hours. Advertisement, and specifically visual ads, have always been collages of signs and signifiers used to sell things to targeted demographics. In this way, capitalism is an economy of desire. Essentially, such ads are collages of meaning and can drum up desire for something as simple as a candle to as socially charged as face whitening creams. The social relations that we build out of symbols in this economic and political system do not take time off, even when we choose to vacation from work. In the era we now live in, an age where digital space actively breaks down and cannibalizes the real, for example, fake news, and isolates us in filter bubbles that we happily stay in by choice, this is accompanied by an expansion of capitalism. But this time, it is a change that the atomized subject is ill-equipped to see. When we try to escape work by hiding in the bathroom and browsing Facebook, we move from one form of labor to another. Our clicks are very profitable, though we get very little in return for feeding the artificial research companies that Facebook and Google have. On the Jewish question, Marx says, where the political state has attained its true development, man, not only in thought in consciousness, but in reality in life, leads a twofold life, a heavenly and an earthly life. Life in the political community, in which he considers himself a communal being, and in life in civil society, in which he acts as a private individual, regards other men as means, degrades himself into a means, and becomes the plaything of alien powers. This contradictory life becomes more complicated when you factor in that the logic of the state itself takes on a form of normative personhood. Ultimately, if we cannot free ourselves from the idea of the human as we know it, then we are bound to a peculiar kind of apocalypse, one where we fail to recognize ourselves in others, and this would be in great part because the logic of our state and economy has continued to consume us.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and thank you, Kareem. My name is Joe. I'm going to be the third part of this presentation. Kareem and Alexandra have, I think, adequately diagnosed capitalism and society within our particular philosophical point of view, and have shown that it is parasitic, transcendental, anti-human, and atomizing of the individual subject. My presentation is called Dissipation and New Nature. I will do three things in this presentation. And the first thing I will do is give an overview of left and right political philosophies as they relate to economics. The second, I'm going to talk about value capture, management, and the structure of firms within capitalism. And then third, I'm going to talk about technological progress and liberation. So a cover story last year in The Economist magazine argued that the designations of left and right have become misleading. Since populist economic ideas are resurging within Corbynite leftism as well as Trumpist American fascism, the magazine argues that contemporary politics could be better characterized as open or closed. Those who support markets, migrants, and trade versus those who desire closed ethno-states and nationalist economics. The question I put forth to the gathering here at New Narratives is, what does a leftist economics look like? Often our political imaginations happen at the level of aesthetics without understanding what changes in the material economy that would require. Often we disparage capitalism and laud socialism while our analysis remains upon the surface of those words. In the book, The Reactionary Mind, Corey Robin works on a general theory of historical conservatism. He asks, quote, "How do conservatives convince us that we are one of them? By making privilege democratic and democracy aristocratic. Long before Huey Long cried, 'Every man a king,' a more ambiguous species of Democrat spoke virtually the same words, though to different effect. The promise of democracy is to govern another human being as completely as a monarch governs his subjects. The task of this type of conservatism, democratic feudalism, becomes clear. Surround these old regimes with fences and gates, protect them from meddlesome intruders like the state or a social movement, while descanting on mobility and innovation, freedom, and the future." End quote. Freedom to the Goldwater conservative means the freedom of private schools to segregate students by race, the freedom of Christians to exclude homosexuals, and the freedom of women to stay out of the workplace and inside the home. Milton Friedman's PBS special Free to Choose was performed in skits by the Students in Free Enterprise Organization of Arkansas in the 1970s, claiming that the businessman is not a bully, but the victim of socialist governments. Reaction tends to borrow the language of leftist liberation and turn it back on itself, using rights-based frameworks to defend old regimes. The ambidexterity of new articulations of reaction positions, for example, whites in America not as a ruling class, but as another ethnicity with its own history of oppression and struggle requiring its own liberation movement. Ayn Rand claimed that, quote, "All achievement and progress has been accomplished, not just by men of ability, and certainly not by groups of men, but by a struggle between man and mob," end quote. Fascist thought from Mussolini to Donald Trump features as the mechanism of history great men of achievement versus an indolent mob. The fundamental rightist reactionary viewpoint of politics and economics is a defense of positions of privilege. Fenced perimeters prevent the dissipation of value, culture, or intangible spirit and identity. 20th century fascism reacted to the other within national boundaries as an infectious internal contagion in the genetics of the political body. Whereas in the 21st century, the other assails the nation from without and invades through the porous vectors of international trade and migration. The most vociferous Trump policies focus specifically on these vectors: the travel ban, steel tariffs, and retreat from global trade agreements, and the southern border wall. Brexit was also motivated chiefly by these two prongs: anxiety around the orifices of trade and migration as inflows or outflows from which nationality dissipates. Why is trade so dirty, unclean, and subject to rituals of purification and rejection? Jared Lanier, a former Wired magazine editor and futurist, develops the economic metaphor of levees in the book Who Owns the Future? Considering the economy as a system of capital flows, allegorized as an ocean or a river, quote, levees are broad dams of modest altitude intended to hold back the natural flow of fluid to protect something precious. A mountain of them rising in the middle of the economy might be visualized as a mountain of rice paddies, creating a prosperous land in the tempest of capital, end quote. At the far end of the river, the propertied class threatens to retain the entirety of the capital flow and leave the majority of proletariats in drought. Government-granted and labor-won protections such as academic tenure, union membership, taxi medallion ownership, licensure, copyright and patents, and social welfare systems are terraces building the topography of middle-class value capture. So, we see again in leftism the dynamics of power as a struggle between a perimeter-fenced mastery and the threat of dissipation at its edges. Levees, fences, and perimeters are relevant today because of a social anxiety relating to production and automation. The question of sustainable capitalist development is, can development occur forever and for everybody? Can everyone become middle management? Automation, freeing a laborer from production, enables the laborer to become a manager of the exploitation of more laborers. This is how fears of automation are assuaged in the first world, that the displacement of factory work shifts an efficiency surplus somewhere else to create jobs that are secondary to production. David Autor, an economist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, writes that, quote, automating a particular task so that it can be done more quickly or cheaply increases the demand for human workers to do the other tasks around it that have not been automated, end quote. Cheaper labor which exists on the fringes of society can join the productive process. Autor points to bank tellers and ATM machines. Wouldn't ATM machines displace bank tellers from the economy? Actually, the number of bank tellers in the United States has grown since the introduction of ATMs. Automation has not displaced an absolute number of workers. It increases the productivity of the firm overall, allowing for a greater capture of value from without it, and productive workers can shift tasks from primary production, which adds surplus value, to informational labor, whose wages are paid from the efficiency gain. When deindustrialization takes place on a national or social level, labor shifts out of primary production into management and service informational labor. These are better jobs. But why? Why do management jobs pay more when they're actually divorced from the labor process, such that the farther away one is from value-adding labor, the greater one's income? I like to use the production process of the acai berry as an example of a commodity because it is an agricultural product. It therefore has fewer natural resource constraints. It is also not a staple, but rather a luxury good which is eaten by consumers as a superfood. The first step in the production of acai are the laborers. They work in the rainforests of Brazil and neighboring countries on land which they do not own. At harvest time, laborers pay the operators of small motorboats to haul their product to middlemen at markets who sell to industrial processors, who then sell to distribution companies that take the final product to market. This could be any process of any commodity. Analyzing the labor and its productivity and money value,
The laborers seem to be the least productive workers, and the owner of the distribution company is the most productive. I argue that this is an illusion generated by the organization of supply chains by the institutional modality of the firm. Management is only more productive because fewer numbers of managers purchase the value created by a huge number of primary producers. The transfer of property rights between laborers and subsequent firms increases the concentration of labor. Surplus value is not just reappropriated by the capitalists, but the largest distributors of acai berry products are located in countries other than Brazil. Its value is geographically dislocated. In this case, to a handful of companies in metropolitan Brazil, California, Florida, and Hawaii. In Lanier's terms, the architecture of market relations between labor and firms form levees of value capture. The middle class as a global strata exists because of the transfer of wealth from primary producers to management or ownership. The transfer of wealth as arranged by the sale of property rights to surplus value is the operational mode of soft power neocolonialism. I think that the Trumpist economic aesthetics of wanting to return to coal mining and industrial production implicitly understands that there is something unheimlich about this arrangement of management services for global product, something precarious, as if it were an illusion which might be dispelled. The right's defense, as in the right wing's defense of its position of privilege in reaction, displays the essential direction of leftism in the negative, that leftists should dismantle structures of dominance and dissipate power. My understanding of what the left ought to do in economics is fundamentally to dismantle neocolonialism. Left accelerationism believes that historical progress, turned by the motor of technological development, will provide the means for fair distribution of production and the recoupment of human dignity for all people. The economist Ronald Coase first discussed the economics of firms in 1937. Firms are economically viable when markets have high transaction costs. The Economist magazine explains his theory, quote, "It is often cheaper to direct tasks by fiat than to negotiate and enforce separate contracts for every last transaction. Such exchange costs are low in markets for uniform goods," wrote Coase, "but are high in other instances," end quote. Under this explanation, lower market transaction costs could reduce the need for productive processes to be housed within a single firm. Capital and markets, as rationality machines, depend on accurate information to function efficiently and produce optimal outcomes. New media technologies which reduce spatial and temporal boundaries will reduce distortions and barriers in economic production and political power. Economics, to the Marxist, progresses in a media environment. Industry is foremost an organization of knowledge. The means of the creation and dissemination of knowledge is of importance to the Marxist critique. The material forms of information, whether they be print, radio, or telecommunications, are the vectors of capital and exchange. When dominant modes of information change or their capacities expand and intensify, we expect capital and production to transform in kind. The existence of the firm is called into question for more flexible arrangements of production. Companies like Amazon and Facebook defy the existing logic of antitrust labor and regulatory laws. In the Minnesota Law Review, June Carboni and Nancy Levitt write on the opinion in Burwell v. Hobby Lobby, a landmark 2014 U.S. Supreme Court case, quote, "As the firm, that is, the corporate form used to structure most business organizations, becomes less dependent on fixed supply chains and hard to assemble labor forces, the networks that determine employee motivation, security, and career mobility also change. These shifts fundamentally alter the relationship of people to companies, as owners, executives, shareholders, and employees all become more mobile," end quote. The Amazon Marketplace takes advantage of low market costs by coordinating between buyers and sellers, such that some producers ship directly from factory to Amazon warehouses, eliminating a stage of value capture in the supply chain, making labor more efficient and goods cheaper. Jared Lanier notes that network systems can produce more winner-take-all outcomes. Firms like Walmart and Amazon, which have dissolved supply chains within themselves, are more efficient than their rivals. Furthermore, Amazon reveals that deterritorialized retail needs not be redundant. Rather than retailers competing with retailers, Amazon dissolves retail into a single stream so that producers can compete directly with one another for customers. Amazon does not transform retail, it consolidates retail into a single universal platform. Lena M. Kahn writes in the Yale Law Journal that Amazon is more than a firm performing one task, but a series of platforms. To treat it like a firm in law is to ignore a very real danger of its monopolizing power. Rather, we should understand it as a sort of platform. Amazon Web Services offers consumers the chance to pay for web services as needed. Silicon Valley entrepreneur and writer Noah Jessup writes, quote, AWS's Lambda functions, pay per function compute versus paying per machine hour, continues to abstract away any notion of anything that would look like the service of a traditional firm, measured in services in a center and employees to look over them, end quote. Housing an entire operation of web services within a firm costs an inefficiency when those services are not fully utilized. In this case, market transaction costs are so low that it makes sense to externalize them. We can think of AWS like Uber, in that it is cheaper for both consumers and society to hail a car that is always somewhere in use than it is to buy a car that sits in a garage for a greater amount of time. Capital is less often idle and it becomes more efficient. Capital and inputs are networked across the economy. Then, those who are responsible for the coordination of the networks become the most powerful institutions. Jessup writes, quote, in a world where there's a single clear winner who has or ought to take all, for each and every business problem, what's left? If everything is abstracted to a clear per usage billing price, a price far lower than other alternatives might offer, will COSA's transaction costs still hold the notion of the firm together, end quote. If fewer firms which regulate the information of production exist, then there is actually less need for cognitive labor in capitalism. Automation replaces industrial labor. Information technology replaces info labor. The price barriers between producers and consumers are fewer. The economy as a whole went from feudal primordial soup into a body constituted by organ-like firms and factory productions within industrial capitalism. Are these organs dissolving? Can a straight line between production site and consumer re-territorialize capital and reverse the flow of value capture from hinterlands to metropolis? Whereas the natural, one possibility is that the blockchain can recite value to place of production. Whereas the natural environment, such as the rainforest, is undervalued, geolocating blockchain identities could give an accurate account of how rainforest resources are used in economic circuits. This would constitute an anti-colonial revolution. By depriving the global management class of its price-taking levy, nature would be reconstituted as a planetary whole, and automation would no longer demand greater numbers of employment and cognitive labor, demanding an increased drain on natural resources. Another specific industry I would like to describe is the dockless bicycle sharing system, using blockchain accounting methods to track bicycles and receive payments. The information system between users and capital, which would be the bicycles, the machines, resists the aggregating tendency of production to obscure value creation within the supply chain. The transactions for which the bicycle or the piece of capital is involved would be pinned to the physical machine. The point I want to highlight is that the site at which profit is calculated to accrue to capital is at the point of production rather than accounted for at the level of the firm. The bicycle is an example of a good or service which has transcended the bounds of the firm because the transaction costs of its market have been sufficiently lowered by information technology. This is remarkable for a number of reasons. First, we have re-territorialized capital. Second, we have dissolved the firm's political, economic power position through a cloud sourcing of its accounting and management needs. Third, this is a more accurate accounting method for society to freely manage its capital outside of the capitalist class. Blockchain solves the problem of capitalist deletion of space-time by compressing the supply chain's time and space dimensions. So, the apocalypse which I would like to suggest is the possibility that capitalism and nation-state political models will not persist into an indefinite future, but that the developments of capital through changing media modes that radically altered the connection between information, territory, space, and time portend a paradigmatic shift in institutional modalities. Specifically, the dissolution of the firm as an organ of capitalist society may shift the siting of economic value from ownership, from capitalists, to production, to workers, and upend the imperialist structure of neoliberalism. Without organs, the body of production is a rhizome of free arrangements and low transaction costs. As information technology intensifies, the complexity of systems streamlines, becomes ambient, spreading from its metropolitan centers of capital to become coterminous with the almost forgotten planetary real, a process of dissipation. Thank you.
Because of reorganization of time, now we will switch directly to Diane, and then we will open the forum for your questions. I already have one. So, Diane Bauer is in part of her practice co-founder, member of Laboreoconomics Collective, which in 2015 published the Xenofeminist Manifesto. This is also the reason why I pair Anon and Laboria, because at the first they share